Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing story of Pensacola, North America's first place city. And in this series of episodes, we've been dealing with how we've enjoyed a kind of a love affair with the automobile through most of the life of the automobile itself here in Escambia County in Pensacola. And in our last episodes, we've developed the story of who the first automobile makers were, who our first dealers were in Pensacola, which of the automobiles we sold and serviced here. And then in the last episode, we talked a little bit about some of the things that early automobile owners had to deal with in the way that they treated and ran their automobiles, at least up through the 1930s. And we begin our story today at a time in the early part of the 1930s when Pensacola's people just loved the automobile. We had a population across the county of about 45,000, and at that point in time there was about 11,000, almost 11,000 and a half cars and trucks in the county, which illustrates how popular this had become. Now, when we moved into the 30s, of course, and the Depression struck, all things happened that were not good. Of course, people without jobs or with limited incomes are not good customers for an automobile. And as a result of that, as we moved from 1930 through the 31, 32, 33, a great number of the manufacturers' makes that had become so popular, makes like the Stutz Bearcat, for example, they just disappeared from the scene. They were gone and gone forever. In Pensacola, many of the dealers did survive, although some of them, of course, departed as well. Now, as we come into the 30s, some new additions are found. Now, one of the things that was introduced to the trade, to the automotive trade, came at the Chicago World's Fair in 1933 and 34, when the Ford Motor Company, as part of its exhibit there, illustrated how they were now making what they called safety glass. Now, previous to this time, all of the windows in a car or truck were made of conventional glass. And of course, a shattered window or shattered windshield or something like that in an accident was a terrible thing. It could result in horrible injuries. And the safety glass, of course, was a wonderful invention. This made people so excited, and that it did include an incentive there for people to come in and say, well, it's safer for my family to have this. I'll go without something else if we can buy this car. Other things that began to come along now, of course, were of equal interest to a lot of people. Number one was hydraulic brakes. Previous to that, all of the brakes on the cars were mechanical. They literally, the brake pedal, when pressure was applied, literally did put the pressure on the brake drum and caused the car to slow or stop. Hydraulic brakes were totally different, and when they came on stream, of course, everyone wanted to have hydraulic brakes, and the General Motors Corporation in particular profited from that. The next one was what they called knee action. This was a new device, a new system that allowed the two front wheels to move more casually over uneven terrain and made the driving position much more comfortable. And of course, knee action was then soon accompanied by better springs in a car, because step by step we were making the emphasis on motoring more comfortable, because more women were driving automobiles by this time. Of course, as we move into the 30s, people are having to make their cars last. If someone had traded in every 3 or 4 years in prior years, now with the Depression here, they couldn't do that. And so all sorts of measures were taken to try and make the car last longer. One of the things that was perfectly obvious was in what they called seat covers. Now, we don't see that much anymore, but in the 30s, of course, the conventional original seat covering on front and back seats would wear and they'd get holes in it and so forth. And so a very enterprising company came out with basically an idea that you could simply put over the top of the seat, use drawstrings on it. They were very attractive, and the seat cover, of course, produced a new addition to the automobile. By the time we're to the mid-30s, we are now beginning to get across the country a better network of roads. Because as we mentioned in the first episode, the early roads when automobiles came along were a pretty treacherous thing to have to drive. But now step by step and year by year, even with the Depression, we were getting better ones. And of course, one of the things that the New Deal administration tried to do during the course of the Depression years was to provide funds which would be used for road building and road improvement. And this happened, so that enabled people to travel longer distance. Well, if you go longer distance, of course, you're obviously from time to time, you're going to have to stay overnight. And so now you begin to see a whole new vista of accommodations rising up. The earliest ones that we see in any number are called tourist homes. This is basically what today we would call a B&B, or bed and breakfast. It was someone who would say, okay, we've got 2 or 3 extra bedrooms. We'll make them available. We'll put a sign up on the street or on the highway and say you can stay here overnight for $2 or something like that. And basically the tourist home came into being. About the same time, the idea of the tourist court was originated. The tourist court was basically what we would today call a motel, except that in most instances, the places for sleeping were little huts, I guess, little cottages. Each one was an individual place, and the driver could drive right in, put his car beside the facility, and that was his place to stay. Many times they did not have indoor plumbing, so many women didn't care for them a lot, but nonetheless, that was the second step, and we would not get into the idea of the kind of tourist accommodations that we have today until a good many years after that. Now, as we went into the middle of the 1930s, the automobile industry itself was like everybody else. They had to cut costs frantically, and the price of an automobile began to come down, or at least many of them. Now, we have to remember that in the latter part of the 1920s, in the last years that Henry Ford produced his Model T, he had gotten the price of his car down, a 2-door coupe available from Detroit. He had gotten it down to just $265. Now, of course, you had to pay the transport to get it down to wherever you lived, but nonetheless, that was a much advertised price. And by the time we get into the later stages of the 1930s, Chevrolet was selling its new cars for about $700, which a lot of people thought, well, that's a terrible amount of money. We still can't afford that, but nonetheless, that was basically an ongoing price. And about the same time, you begin to see other additions made to make for the comfort and the security of driving. In the late period of 1938, early 1939, the General Motors and Chrysler both came out with an innovation. They took the gear shift off of the floor of the car and put it on the steering post, so that the driver could use his hand much more flexibly, and they didn't have that obstruction on the floor. About the same time, the Studebaker company came up with another idea that they called the hill holder. Basically, this was an emergency brake which was placed on the left-hand side of the car beside the clutch on the automobile itself. And when one had to stop on a hill, you simply pressed that as an emergency brake, and it worked. Well, that allowed to take the old emergency brake off the floor of the car, and we were making it a lot more roomy for people driving in the front of the car itself. Now, let's suppose that you're in the latter part of the 30s now, and the Depression is still with us. What did it cost to drive your car? Well, a gallon of the lowest price I ever saw for a gallon of gasoline was 12.5 cents. There were others, the conventional brands, the Sinclair and Chevron and Standard Oil Company and Gulf Oil, Pure Oil. They were probably on the average selling for either 15, 16, or 17 cents a gallon, but that was basically it. A new tire at that point in time cost about $5. This is a replacement tire, of course, on your vehicle. And some of the niceties that you begin to enjoy come along with it. Now, we're in the latter part of the 30s, and now people with a bright look to the future, a number of restaurant entrepreneurs begin opening what they call drive-in restaurants. And basically, this is a place where you could drive your car in, you parked, and a lovely young lady usually came out, sometimes even on roller skates, took your order, and then delivered your hamburger or soft drink or whatever, right? And you put it on a tray on the window ledge of your car, and you ate lunch there. The drive-in restaurant was quite a success for a long time. Almost exactly the same time, someone else said, well, a motion picture is inexpensive entertainment for the family, but even so, if mom and dad go and they pay a quarter each, and each of the children are charged 10 cents, you could still run up as much as $1 going to the movies. So now somebody else said, well, we've got this vacant pasture out there, let's open a drive-in movie. And basically what would happen with the whole family in the car, drives in, parks the car, and they put a speaker line from a post inside the car. You're looking at a screen in the distance, and the drive-in movie would be a feature in the automobile industry for a long time to come. It didn't disappear locally here until well into the 1970s. Well, we come to the latter part of the 1930s, and another innovation, of course, comes to us here that really opens up the automobile traffic. It is in that year, 1937, that Highway 98 is completed along the shore, allowing us to drive our automobiles from here all the way to Perry, Florida. Now that was an innovation that was sparked by a man named Edward Ball, who literally, to get the county commissioners along the way to invest in bonds to build that road, he literally, from the DuPont company, he literally helped underwrite them to assure that the bondholders would be reimbursed if something bad happened. So by 1937, we do have a highway along the coast, and the other roads, of course, the Highway 90 is being improved at the same time, and they are just now redoing Highway 29, which had been completed, as I think we mentioned earlier, sometime earlier, because that highway connected Century and Alabama to us here on the southern part. Well, we moved into the war years. Now, the war, of course, began in December of 1941, and almost immediately automobiles were affected. They were affected, number one, because the government knew that the government and all agencies involved in the war were going to need all of the available cars and trucks. So within 60 days of Pearl Harbor, there was a definite halt to sale of new cars. They were put on what we would today call a priority list, and the government, of course, assured who was going to get them. Someone would have to have a really good use set for them, and counties and city governments and so forth were among them. The military, of course, having the highest priority of all. Now, as we move forward, of course, this meant to drive a car, you're going to have some other problems, because the country itself was facing two shortages. Number one was in that of rubber, and the second one was petroleum. Now, the petroleum shortage wasn't as critical as the rubber. We could drill for more oil and produce more gasoline, but rubber. The rubber plantations in the Far East were under the control of the Japanese, and we knew we weren't going to get any more of that, and consequently rubber was very carefully rationed, and people were given very careful education and instruction on how to protect and preserve their tires. A new tire, for example, was all but impossible to get. They were rationed, and only the highest priority could get them. So new businesses came into play, how to put what they called a retread on an automobile, or making a new addition on the outside of the casing. So we recap or retread tires, and for the next 4 years, basically that was the only choice you had. And people, believe me, the people were very, very careful not to drive excessively, and to be very careful how they took care of their tires as far as inflation and all the rest of it. Now, through the war, of course, we have a very great struggle for the automobile dealers. They have no new cars to sell. Used cars, of course, are a market, and most of the dealers who survived those years did so by being very good at helping their customers maintain their cars, because all of the basic simple services were ingrained in people. If you had a car and you knew you weren't going to get another one for 2 or 3, 4 years, you did everything you could to stretch the wearability and the value of that car out, and people did. And that's basically the way it was. By this time, of course, people are looking ahead. We're beginning, by the time we get to 1945, the customer is beginning to see all sorts of wonderful futuristic pictures and designs of what the cars in the future are going to look like. And they began to talk about all kinds of wonderful things that would be added. We had the first experiment with an automatic transmission in 1941 with the Oldsmobile, but up to that point, beyond that, no other automobile had an automatic transmission. And so as we approach the end of the war, people are saying, well, what's going to come next? We can hope that we're going to have all sorts of wonderful things. There's talk about having air conditioning, and of course the idea of even putting carpeting in cars to make them a little bit more luxurious. All of this is coming, and people can't, as the war winds down, they can't wait to what they're going to have when the new cars become available late 1945.